Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you are. It is noon here in beautiful and hot Boulder, Colorado. And we are happy that you're spending some time of your busy day with us here at WCET today. If you don't know me, my name is Van Davis. I am the Executive Director of WCET and Vice President for Digital Learning at WICHE. That's the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, one of the nation's 4 regional higher education compacts. If you're not familiar with WCET, we are a membership organization that focuses on the intersection of policy and practice and excellence in digital learning. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Kim is going to be sharing a link to the slides shortly, so you will be able to download them in the chat. In fact, she's already shared it over there if you're interested in following along. We will have time at the end for question and answers. If you could do us a big favor and put any of your questions into the Q&A rather than the chat, that will help us immensely. And once they're in the Q&A, feel free, folks, to follow along there and upvote questions that you really would like us to tackle before the end of today. And then finally, feel free to use the chat section to share resources and thoughts throughout the webinar today. The slides, the recording, and any additional resources that are shared will be emailed to you next week. And then I'd like to share our accessibility commitment with you. At WCET, we take accessibility very seriously. If you need the slides in an alternative format or additional accommodations, please let us know. And you can scan the QR code there to download the slides on your phone if you prefer. We do design our slides with high contrast visuals, large text, and descriptive alt text for all images. So please let us know if you require other accommodations, however. Today's webinar is Understanding Recent Federal Department of Education Policy and Practice Updates. There's been a lot that's been going on, as you will see, and we hope to help explain all of that to you. What I'm going to do is ask Cheryl and Catherine to introduce themselves, and then Cheryl's going to give us a brief overview. This webinar is being hosted in partnership with SAN. SAN is the State Authorization Network, which is a part of WCET. So Cheryl, Catherine, how about if, since everyone now knows who I am, Cheryl, why don't you introduce yourself? Catherine can introduce herself, and then Cheryl's going to give us a quick overview.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Van. My name is Cheryl Dowd. I'm the Senior Director for the State Authorization Network and WCET Policy Innovations. The State Authorization Network, as Van explained, is a network of WCET, and our focus is on interstate activities of the institution and the policy and compliance management of that interstate activity. And I'm going to turn it over to Catherine.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm Catherine Kerensky. I'm the Director of Digital Learning Policy and Compliance with SAN, supporting members with a variety of interstate distance education compliance issues. And I previously did this type of work at an institution before joining SAN 5 years ago.
Great. And I think I'm going to give you all an overview of what we intend to do today. So again, welcome. This is a high-level overview of important federal regulatory developments that have an impact on our digital learning community. So there are many more new regulatory issues in play at this time than we typically see each year. So our intention is to give you this big picture of the issues and take your questions. So we will cover, initially we'll start with survey findings on the real institutional work when offering professional licensure programs for the state federal requirements for the institutions. Then we're going to move to a set of new regulatory packages that were developed to implement the One Big Beautiful Bill Act federal statute, often referred to as OB3, that was enacted July of 2025. Those rules will include rules that were developed in two different rulemakings, one called the RISE rulemaking that gave us the loan limits regulations, and then also the AHEAD committee, which was broken into two sections. The first gave us the Pell and Workforce Pell regulations, and then more recently, the release of final regulation for stats and earnings accountability. Our final group of regulations that we're going to address are a myriad of things. We will address rules that are vacated. We will address rules that are new but are from the Biden administration. And then finally, a summary related to the accreditation regulations that are still in process, having just held their rulemakings earlier this spring. So to get us started, I'm going to turn over to Catherine to talk about professional licensure.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I'll spend the next few minutes talking about licensure compliance, which is an area I'm sure some of you have felt has become an increasingly significant challenge for institutions that offer licensed professions. As you'll hear, it's not just a compliance issue, it affects enrollment decisions, staffing, risk, and ultimately the educational opportunities that are available to students. And just to preface, as Cheryl mentioned, to better understand how institutions are navigating these challenges, SAN conducted a national survey of colleges and universities responsible for licensure compliance to try and determine where is licensure compliance workload showing up, how are institutions managing it, and then what kind of decisions and impacts are emerging. So I'll use the findings from that survey throughout the next several slides to illustrate what institutions are experiencing in practice. And I think to start, to understand why institutions are experiencing these impacts, it's helpful to start with the requirement itself. So when we talk about professional licensure, in general, we're referring to academic programs that prepare students for regulated professions, such as nursing, teaching, engineering, and many others. Under federal regulations, institutions are required to determine whether a program meets the educational requirements for licensure in the student's state before the student enrolls in the program. This means institutions can't simply admit every qualified applicant to a licensure program. They must first determine whether the curriculum satisfies that state's educational requirements for licensure. And again, if the institution determines that the program does not meet those requirements, or if they're unable to make a determination, the institution cannot enroll that student in the program. And this is really important because these determinations influence the enrollment decisions, where students have access to educational opportunities, and the institution's ability to serve students across state lines. We can go to the next slide. It's also important to note that making these determinations correctly is critical. An institution that incorrectly determines a program meets the state's educational requirements for licensure can face Title IV compliance concerns, potential impacts on federal financial aid eligibility, student complaints, and even litigation. There's also a very real impact on students. Students may invest considerable time and money in a program, believing it will prepare them for licensure, only to discover later that it doesn't meet their state's requirements. So for both institutions and students, getting these determinations right is essential. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. Given those stakes, you might assume institutions can simply ask a state board whether a program meets the requirements. But in practice, that's usually not how it works. One of the misconceptions about licensure compliance is that state licensing boards would tell institutions whether their programs meet the educational requirements for licensure. While in reality, while these state boards are an authoritative source for licensure requirements, they often do not evaluate or certify institutional programs. So that means institutions are responsible for analyzing all state requirements where they intend to operate and determining whether their own programs meet those requirements. Our survey illustrates just how institutions are approaching that work. Only 6% reported relying primarily on a direct confirmation from state licensing boards. So that means 94% are operating in some other way without direct confirmation from licensing boards. 35% said they make their determinations through their own interpretation of state requirements, and the rest said that they combined their institutional analysis with some form of outside source. And so the key takeaway here is that institutions are doing much of this regulatory analysis by themselves that's needed to support the enrollment decisions. Thank you. So what is it like to make these analyses and decisions? Our survey suggests that for many institutions, the answer is not very easy. More than half of respondents reported difficulty obtaining clear information from state licensing boards, and a similar percentage cited inconsistent or unclear state requirements. Other institutions pointed to the cost of meeting state-specific requirements and restrictions affecting online or hybrid programs as significant challenges. And when institutions can't confidently determine whether a program meets a state's requirements, they're often left with a difficult choice, and many choose to limit where they enroll students. In fact, about a third of our survey respondents reported restricting enrollment in at least one state for at least one of their licensure programs. And the comments we received suggest that this is not limited to a single program or a single state, because many institutions described restricting multiple programs across numerous states because they couldn't confidently certify that the program met requirements and proceed with enrollment. So while each individual restriction may seem small, the cumulative effect can significantly reduce where institutions are able to serve students. If we can go to the next slide. It's also important to note that the restrictions aren't evenly distributed across programs. They're concentrated in some high-demand professional programs. When we looked at which programs institutions were most likely to restrict, we saw some of the most commonly affected programs were nursing, teacher education, mental health, and other health science professions, all fields where there's significant workforce demand. Institutions reported restricting enrollment in states such as California, New York, Texas, Washington, Colorado, and Tennessee. So really all across the United States. If we can go to the next slide. So why does this work require so much institutional effort? Part of that is that licensure compliance is not exist in a vacuum. It's not driven by a single regulation or agency. So institutions are navigating multiple overlapping compliance obligations, which can include state authorization requirements, state licensing board requirements, disclosures, consumer protection, and for many institutions, SARA-related responsibilities, and also managing other federal initiatives that affect licensure programs, possibly veteran education benefits programs, and other Title IV compliance concerns. And each of these has their own requirements and timelines and documentations. And when you consider that this is across dozens of professions for some institutions and more than 50 states and territories, the work can become increasingly complex. We can go to the next slide. So what does all that complexity mean for people doing this work? That's exactly what we asked institutions in the survey. And given that complexity, it's probably not surprising that 86% of institutions reported a moderate or significant increase in workload related to these requirements. What's particularly noteworthy is that while the work has grown, staffing often has not. Instead of adding dedicated resources, many institutions reported that these responsibilities have been absorbed by existing compliance teams or staff alongside their other responsibilities. And as I've mentioned, these modest increases can add up quickly when institutions are managing multiple programs. If we can go to the next slide. So what does that increase in workload look like? The survey asked institutions to estimate how much additional time they're spending each week on these responsibilities. Nearly half of institutions reported adding 7 or more hours per week to support licensure compliance activities. Another large group reported adding between 1 and 6 hours a week. At the higher end of the range, there were some institutions who reported adding more than 20 hours per week, and only about 7% reported adding less than an hour of additional work per week. And if we can go to the next slide. So where is all that time going? The biggest driver is that institutions are working to maintain access for students while meeting their compliance obligations. So rather than restricting enrollment, many institutions are investing time in researching state requirements, evaluating program alignment, engaging with licensing boards and external stakeholders, and working with academic programs to understand and document compliance. This includes developing policies, processes, and documentations that are needed to support ongoing decision-making and demonstrate compliance. And importantly, that work does not just happen once and it's finished. Because requirements change, institutions have to continually monitor and update their determinations. The overall picture from the survey is clear that licensure compliance has grown into an ongoing institutional function that requires coordination across the institution, dedicated expertise, and sustained resources. For institutions, there's a challenge between balancing two important goals: maintaining compliance while continuing to provide students with access to programs that prepare them for high-demand professions. I'd be happy to take any questions at the end, but with that, I will turn it over to Cheryl to explore our next topic.
Great. Thank you very much, Catherine. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just to get us started, we're going to be talking about the regulatory packages that came related to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so we'll start with a very quick high-level reminder about rulemaking, and then we'll talk about the two committees. Just the quick reminder about rulemaking is that administrative agencies are required to follow federal statute in the development of rules, and they follow the Administrative Procedures Act. Specific to Title IV related regulations, the Department of Education has an additional responsibility that's written through the Higher Education Act, the HEA. And in a nutshell, what it provides is this idea of negotiated rulemaking using key stakeholders to help develop the rules. There's also an element called the master calendar, which is a timeline structure that is meant to support federal financial aid so that the institutions are prepared for the next federal financial aid year, meaning that if a rule, the master calendar indicates that if the rules are released as final by November 1, they can become effective the next July. What we see here, and the reason I bring this forward, is to note with these regulations we're going to talk about that the Department of Education indicated that the Congress had implied that this master calendar is to be waived because of what was written specifically inside the federal statute for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So it's following an accelerated timeline to be final and to be effective. And we'll talk about what that means as we move forward. Could we go to the next slide, please? So before I start this, I am going to share with you a link to an FSA webpage, the Federal Student Aid. They are going to continue to have trainings as well as office hours for the implementation of regulations that were tied to the implementation of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So I just want to offer that to you to be able to have a review. So the first came out of the RISE committee, that's the loan limits. And so what we saw here is that there was the elimination of the Grad Plus loans for new borrowers, annual and lifetime benefits for annual and lifetime limits for Parent Plus, lifetime loan limits for all students. And then what had more conversation was around this whole idea of annual and lifetime borrowing limits for graduate versus professional programs. And that has been much written about in the news lately. And what we see there is that the regulatory definition of the professional program has been temporarily blocked by the courts. So there was a court challenge to this definition and regulation, and that was temporarily on pause while we wait for further direction from the court. And so I'm also going to offer for you the Department of Education's directions while this litigation is in progress. So what they have offered is this guidance that indicates, need the whole link for that. And it was just updated yesterday, but what it provides is that the court indicated that the institutions are to follow the statutory definition because in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, it did define what they intended to be a professional program, providing 3 elements plus a series of 10 examples that indicated in the regulation that was pointed to in the statute that it was as examples and not limited to. So while this proceeds in litigation, the institutions are to review this guidance from the Department of Education about what is a professional program, because within this court order, it was indicated that for this time, the loan limits are not temporarily blocked. So the institutions are to move forward with the loan limits, but they are to use the definition found in statute for which the Department of Education has provided guidance. So we urge people to have a look at that. And yes, it's part of resources that Kim has indicated as well. I'm just highlighting this one because they did just update this yesterday. Can we go to the next slide, please? The second rulemaking that was held related to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was the AHEAD committee. And so within the AHEAD committee, it was broken into 2 one-week structures. The first addressed Pell and Workforce Pell. And so what was a part of this is you'll see related to Pell. So Pell eligibility is limited when non-federal aid covers cost of attendance. So people need to pay attention to that as they're addressing the Pell eligibility of the students. moving forward, the larger part of that regulatory package had to deal with the expansion of Pell eligibility for workforce programs that are of a short term in nature. So they are 8 to 14 weeks in length. So that the Congress had intended that this be a very state specific implementation. So there is strong reliance on the state to develop a process to review programs that are high need, high wage, or in demand industry sectors or occupations in their state. So this is something that is going to be specific state to state, for which then the federal, the Department of Education, or WIOA, will review the programs for approval. This is something that institutions will have to have their programs reviewed initially and then renewed to continue as being eligible for Workforce Pell. Something for this community to understand is that the this short-term opportunity is also available for distance education programs. Specifically, if an institution is offering an interstate distance education program, they need to be aware that that will require bilateral agreements between the states. So if your student is located in a different state than the institution, then those two states will have to have a bilateral agreement to be able to offer that program for program approval to the other state. You may ask, well, what about reciprocity? So to be clear, institutional approval can be gained through reciprocity through SARA, but this is a program approval structure such that there will have to be bilateral agreements because, as I was indicating, Congress intended this to be very specific to the needs of the states. And to be aware, there are new earnings and implement employment outcome accountability measures, that 70% completion of the program by students and 70% obtain employment within 180 days of completion. So what we're seeing here is that states are in the development of these structures. This is something that has just become available for the states. As of a recent report, I read that 16 states have introduced legislation this year to prepare for workforce Pell development. So stay tuned as you are watching states and institutions prepare to be able to offer this opportunity for students. Can we go to the next slide, please? And then the second part of the AHEAD committee had to do with earnings accountability. This was just recently released on July 1 of 2026. It has an effective date of July 1, 2027 with some exceptions. So the purpose was to changes to institutional and programmatic accountability, to be able to have a single accountability metric that is applicable to all programs regardless of sector. What they have developed is something that has been colloquially described as do no harm. It's a new earnings-based outcomes test, such that the institutions must meet these outcomes tests or face consequences of loss of direct loan eligibility for programs that fail the earnings test in 2 out of 3 consecutive years. So the intention for this program is to provide some alignment and simplification of gainful employment and financial value transparency with the reporting requirements, and it is a harmonization, but it is to be more widely adaptable to all programs. So what we will see here is that undergraduates, there must be shown that the completers' earnings equal or more than the median annual earnings with high school diploma or GED holders that are 25 to 34 years of age in the state. And then for graduate programs, annual earnings that are equal or more than the median annual earnings of 25 to 34-year-olds with bachelor's degrees. And there are certain elements of this in terms of the cohort size and how far that they will be reviewing to determine whether they have met these statistics and are be able to maintain their direct loan eligibility. So this is very high level. I can tell you that there are more specificities about this. And because of that, I am going to give you another link that would be very helpful for you. So for our purposes, we believe that institutions in the digital learning community will be brought into communications with other members of the institutions to be reviewing the programs that will be eligible to be maintained. What we're seeing across institutions is a review of the programs such that there is a determination of whether they will satisfy these new requirements. And what we're seeing is that there is legislation in several states as of now that are indicating that they will have either a bar to be able to offer state loans, or they will have to get separate approval if they have not met requirements that are of this new federal structure. So I have put in the chat NASFA's link, and the link that I put there has some very good worksheets and checklists that are designed for your federal aid staff at your institution. So the financial aid staff at your institution are likely members of NASFA, and they have put together a wonderful OB3 resource page of the implementation structures so that you can see how these elements fit together to address your programs. And so we strongly encourage that the institution staff in digital learning has these collaborations with the financial aid staff moving forward. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the next slide, please. Yeah. So thank you, Kim. So what we're going to address here is another set of rules. Specifically, these are a hodgepodge, to be quite frank, of different rules that have been moved forward by the Trump administration, or a look back because of that master calendar timeline structure I addressed earlier, to look at regulations that were released at the end of the Biden administration, and then of course, looking at the AIM committee. So I will share a little bit about the public service loan forgiveness, primarily to indicate to you that the court, as of this time, has vacated this rule. So public service loan forgiveness program forgives the remaining balance on eligible federal direct loans after a borrower makes 120 qualifying monthly payments while working full-time for a qualified government or nonprofit employer. So this rulemaking looked at what a qualified employer is. And so the direction was to bar those that were deemed substantial, illegal, and purpose. And so for that rulemaking moved forward. It was the first rulemaking of the Trump administration. Shortly, it was in July, end of June, beginning of July of a year ago. But the court just recently ruled, right before it became effective, that they would vacate the rule. They are indicating that it was challenged, and the Department of Education can appeal. But there's no news yet. They have 60 days from the order to determine if they intend to appeal. And then we can move to Van to address the other regulations.
Thanks, Cheryl. If you could move to the next slide, Kim.
So you can move to ahead. Thank you.
There we go. So you may remember that one of the things that happened sort of at the tail end of the Biden administration is that there were two distance education issues that emerged in rulemaking. One was a definition of distance education course. We had a definition of a distance education program in the regulations, but we didn't have a definition of a distance education course. And the other had to do with the reporting of distance and correspondence education enrollments. So 600.2 is the definition of a distance education course. It mirrors that which is used by iPads. This is important because we also know that there are various definitions of what constitutes a distance education course. I'm sorry, I said iPads. I didn't mean iPads. between different federal organizations and state agencies. So the definition of a distance education course is a course in which instruction takes place exclusively as described in the definition of distance education in this section, notwithstanding in-person, non-instructional requirements, including orientation, testing, and academic support services. So there's a carve out for limited face-to-face interactions, especially around orientation and testing and any sort of academic support services, but otherwise it's a distance education course. Related to that, in 600.2 was the addition of 600.2H, which had to do with reporting distance education enrollments and reporting correspondence enrollments. And this is for each recipient of Title IV HEA assistance that the institution would need to report to the secretary in accordance with procedures established by the secretary. And that little clause is important. The recipient's enrollment in distance education and correspondence courses. There were concerns that it would be difficult for institutions to implement this, and it would be difficult for the department to be able to put together those procedures established by the secretary. And so that reporting date was triggered as July 1st, 2027. So new definition of distance education course went into effect July 1st of this year. The actual reporting requirements, which are associated with that definition of a distance education course, don't go into effect until July 1st of 2027. So they don't go into effect until next year. Could you move forward, Kim? I want to pivot and talk a little bit about the accreditation, innovation, and modernization rulemaking that took place this spring. And I want to make a couple of observations before I dig into what is actually in that rulemaking. One is, you may see with OB3 and with AHEAD and with AIM, that one of the things that we see is a department that is leveraging statute, in this case OB3, in the case of those regulations, to fill in for the fact that we have not had a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. And so OB3 really, in effect, is operating as HEA reauthorization. That means all of those things are in statute. And why that is important to point out is that if they're in statute, they're not going to necessarily go away if there's a change in administration. So accountability measures are probably here for the long haul because those are defined in statute. They're not going to go away just because we might see a change in administration. One of the other things that I want to point out, particularly here with the accreditation rulemaking, has to do with the regulatory triad. You may remember that there are three pieces to the regulatory triad. There's accreditors, there's state governments, and there's the federal government. One of the things that we see happening with the AIM negotiated rulemaking and the draft regulations that came out of that is that the federal government is really leaning in on accreditors to help advance their regulatory agenda in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before. Could you go to the next slide, Kim? So there's a number of components, but there's four that I want to really pull out and draw your attention to. And again, this is draft language. The NPRM for these regulations hasn't been released yet, so we don't know what the language is going to be for public comment, nor do we know how long those we will have for public comment, although we're assuming it will be 30 days since that's what we have seen with other negotiated rulemakings. So the first component that I want to draw your attention to is that draft language talks about how accreditors need to remove barriers to innovation. This is going to be particularly important for programs such as competency-based education programs. This administration believes that accreditation has created barriers to innovation, that has made it more difficult for institutions to create competency-based education programs, to create other types of programs, and they want to remove barriers to innovation. One of the other things that came out in the draft language that was adopted by all of the negotiators, there was consensus reached on this language, was an importance of the transfer of credit. And specifically, it said that institutions are going to need to, accreditors need to make sure that institutions allow for the transfer of credit, or at least that there is greater transparency about whether credit is going to be accepted or not accepted, what would be the costs associated with retaking courses and things like that. This may be particularly important for certain types of institutions, and may be particularly important for certain modalities, including distance education. The draft language also created a process by which it would be easier for institutions to change accreditors. Changing accreditors in the past has been a pretty laborious and drawn-out process, and that is changing under this draft language. And then finally, much like with the accountability measures, the draft language coming out of AIM says that accreditors need to look at student outcomes more closely at institutions as a part of the accreditation and reaffirmation process. And in particular, it singles out 4 different metrics of student outcomes that institutions might look at more closely. Completion metrics, scores on standardized exams, such as the LSAT or the MCAT, the employment of graduates in their field, and the cost to earnings ratio. How much does it cost as opposed to what the earnings are? So all of this is new language, potentially, and all of this is potentially new directions and requirements for accreditors to look at as part of the initial accreditation process and part of the reaffirmation process. And this, again, represents a department that is really leaning on other pieces of the triad to advance a regulatory agenda in ways that we haven't necessarily seen before. So if you haven't been, I've been keeping half an eye on the Q&A, and there's a number of questions in the Q&A. If you have put questions in the chat, if you could put those over in the Q&A, I would appreciate it. And take a look at those questions in the Q&A and upvote ones. I'm going to start with a couple of questions to Catherine on professional licensure. And this first one, Catherine, is, can students still sign an attestation form indicating that they know the program may not prepare them for their home state to then be enrolled in the program at a campus that doesn't meet that requirement for their home state?
So the attestation option is kind of like a limited purpose exception to what I described earlier, where the program must meet the requirements in the state where the student is located at the time of initial enrollment. The attestation can be used if the student is able and willing to attest that they intend to seek employment in another state where that program does meet the requirements. So, for example, you have a student who is located in Kentucky, enrolling in your program, and it doesn't meet the requirements. Your program doesn't meet the requirements in Kentucky, but the student says, I actually want to practice in Indiana, and you do meet the requirements in Indiana. That would be the type of exception, or the type of situation where the attestation could be used.
Okay. And related to that, are institutions making these determinations in the survey that you saw based on the prospective student's residence at the time of application, or on the location where the student will receive educational instruction?
So it is at the time of the student's location at the time of initial enrollment, but it's really based on the institution's policies relating to student location. There are elements in federal regulations that already require institutions to have a policy on how they track student location. So the institution, if they don't already have one, should develop those and then follow those. And base it off that. In general, as someone who does state authorization, and thinking of compliance from that lens, it really matters where the student is receiving the education. So keeping that in mind just for a lot of compliance purposes, that would be probably the way to go to consider going. And I'll put a link in a chat. We have sensational awards that cover location. So for anyone who is, kind of unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, you can see institutional examples on how they track student location.
Thank you. And again, this is another one that I think is closely related, and you've sort of answered, but it would be helpful to address it directly. Your slide says that institutions cannot enroll students unless they can certify the program meets the state requirements. I thought that was only if the student was in online courses. If they are, for example, driving across the state border and it's all in person, would an institution be okay?
So the requirements do apply to all modalities. The regulations specifically say that you must be able to certify that the program meets requirements in the institution's home state, where the student is located, if it's distance education, or where the student attests to seeking employment. In the example of what you're saying there, it gets a little more complicated. If there's a chance that if the student is, say, commuting, say from Indiana into Kentucky, and they could take one online course in their first enrollment term, the department has said in guidance that that student would be considered a distance education student, meaning that you would have to do it at the time of where they're considered located. And Cheryl, please feel free to come in. I know this is kind of getting in the weeds in terms of answering that question, but essentially, if all instruction is happening on campus in that first term, then you would go by whether the program meets the institution's home state requirements. But there is that caveat if they're a commuter student institutions have to be aware of.
Catherine did a great job with that response. I just want to add that we asked the department very specifically, especially where states have a lot of people who cross state lines for in-person programs, but they're taking perhaps an elective. We asked the department very specifically if they were taking an elective by distance education and the student actually has an address and a location that is not the same as where the institution is located, then they are to be considered a distance education student in that at time of initial enrollment. So as Catherine indicated, it's based upon the institution's processes to determine what is time of initial enrollment, but it does get very muddy when a student is participating primarily even in person, but is taking as little as one course by distance education from a location across state lines.
And I'm going to throw this question out to either Cheryl or Catherine, whichever one of you wants to answer it. And I know it's something that we get asked quite frequently. What happens when a student enrolls in your program and meets the requirements, but then their home state changes?
Go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah. So the specific requirements that would require an institution to restrict, those are certification procedures. Those apply at the time of initial enrollment. So when it comes to whether you need the attestation or anything like that, if it met the requirements at the time of the student's enrollment in the program, not the institution, it is enrollment in the program, then that would suffice. However, there are other federal requirements that would require a disclosure or notification to the student that the requirements have changed. And those are in federal regulation. Again, we can put the link in the chat for those to get specific timing, but you would want to make sure to have a process where you could notify students that the requirements in their state have changed after initial enrollment.
I would like to add one smidge more. So those are the federal requirements. There could also be state requirements. So if the student moves into a different location, there could be state implications, state rules about how they can be served in that state that would be considered what I put in quotes air quotes, program approval, which is different than institutional approval and is different than the structure developed for federal regulations for purposes of Title IV. So institutions need to be aware of both federal requirements and state-specific requirements.
And I'm going to ask one last question around professional licensure before we pivot to a couple of other areas. This one is a little in the weeds, but I know that y'all have worked with nursing accrediting bodies, and you've worked with some of the educational accrediting bodies. So hopefully you'll be able to answer this. For a profession where the student education departments have specific licensure credential requirements for social workers or SLPs to work in schools, does the program need to look at these specific teacher licensures in addition to the general state professional licensure that is given by the board, not the State Department of Ed? Do you need me to read that one to you again? All
Yes,
right.
please.
For professions where the student education departments have specific licensure and credential requirements for social workers or SLPs to work in schools, does the program need to look at specific teacher licensures in addition to the general state professional licensure that is given by the board and not the Department of Education? And Kim threw it in the chat for if that makes it easier for you. I know this is a tough one. This one is a little in the weeds.
Do you want to go after it, or do we want to piece this apart together?
I'm almost hesitant to give too much of an answer, to want to look into it more because I'm not super familiar with whether that would be its own license in particular, or if it's just job criteria that's like required by the employer, because that would be a difference, at least a little bit. That said, my general advice would be, regardless of what your interpretation of that is, if it's information you can confidently disclose to students, I mean, the more transparency, the better, if it's accurate, to let them know that they might need this extra type of, I don't know, approval or something, whether or not it's a license by that board to be able to teach in that, or to be a practitioner in that particular setting. So that's what I would feel the most comfortable saying right now without knowing all the nuances of that one, but feel free to answer more, Cheryl.
No, well done. That is a challenge. We have some facts here, but what that actually provides for the student is still a question mark. So yeah, I agree with Catherine, and transparency is definitely key in these situations, because especially for regards to the federal regulations were very focused upon the student being able to complete and then be able to have the next steps towards a job. And so they do not want any employment barriers in the state where the student is located.
So Cheryl, I'm going to throw this next question to you to start out, and then I can jump in if you want me to. But any advice for handling compliance for hybrid courses now that RSI can't be applied since they no longer meet the definition of a distance course?
You know, I would like to give that to you because I would like to put more thought into that to be able to piece it apart. But I think that you might have a thought on this more readily available.
I kind of want to think about it as well, because it's not a question that we have had come up yet. I understand the thinking behind the question, and I understand the conundrum that potentially has been inadvertently created. My gut response is that as an institution, you might be able to create institutional requirements even in the face of a lack of federal regulatory requirements. But I think I need to think about it a little bit more as well. I think this may be an unintended consequence. And it's not something that had been that came up in any of the comments on the proposed regulations when they were out for the NPRM. And then there's another one here about distance education courses that I want to look at. And the question is, with the definition of distance education course, wait, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. Where did it go? Sorry, I had a question. Oh, here we go. I'm interested in understanding the new distance education course definition. Our accreditor uses the 50% rule to define a distance education course and programs. How do we balance the ed definition versus the accreditor definition? Should we change our own internal handling of courses we have classified as distance education? And then I would say, to further complicate things, you might have, if you're a public institution, a state definition of distance education that is different. So this is problematic. At the end of the day, you have to be in compliance with the new federal definition of distance education, and you're going to be reporting based on that new federal definition of distance education. My guess is that we will begin to see accrediting bodies change their definitions of distance education. That's my guess of what we will see happen, but we're probably a few years off. What I would do is urge you to have a conversation with your accrediting agency and bring this to their attention and see how they would like you to handle things. But we are well aware that there are multiple definitions of distance education out there, and that has created reporting confusion for institutions and challenges for institutions in terms of needing to track different definitions for different reporting requirements. Again, our hope is, now that we have a federal definition of a distance education course in 600.2, that may mean that the states begin to adopt that definition of a distance education course, and that accreditors begin to adopt that definition of a distance education course. I have one last question that I want to go to, that we're coming up on the end of our time. And this is for both Cheryl and Catherine. And that is, there's been a lot of changes over the last 2 years for institutions to keep up with. And we seem to continue to see changes happening. So how can institutions effectively manage compliance when federal regulations, implementation guidelines, dear colleague letters, and then layer court decisions in on all of this are evolving simultaneously? How does an institution keep up? What can they do to make sure that they stay in compliance when there's still so much confusion in the field? Oh, Cheryl, you're on mute.
Would you like to start, Catherine, or would you like me to start?
I can start by at least thinking of one, like kind of my first thought with all of this is that all of these areas that we touched on today, and several others that we haven't even mentioned, they touch on so many different areas. So if you do not have any sort of, like, for lack of a better word, task force or like regular meeting where you have a bunch of institutional stakeholders, I'd strongly encourage trying to look into that and having some sort of structure to being able to bring these updates to a group of people who can decide on that. I know from my own personal experience doing the work, like once you kind of know of something, it kind of feels like you take ownership of something, but a lot of these requirements go beyond, one individual person. So having a way of knowing who you can bring these things to and who can decide responsibility for taking further action or for monitoring them, I think would do a lot just from easing the burden of responsibility on those who become aware of that. So that's at least my, recommended first step if you can, just to ease that. I think that would be very helpful. Although it's hard to put all that together, I'm aware, but definitely looking for ways to spread out the work so it doesn't fall on one person or one team.
I 100% agree with Catherine on that. As a matter of fact, I just finished writing a blog post about the accountability measures that focuses very much on creating a cross-functional team at your institution to be able to collaborate with your financial aid offices. So specifically today, we've been talking about a lot of things related to Title IV. And so your financial aid office is addressing these things very specifically. But it's going to take some input from other offices at the institution to be able to manage a compliance plan and structure. So as Catherine said, a cross-functional team is super important. I also think within that cross-functional team, it'd be very important to have somebody who has their eyes on the actual language of the rules. Sometimes we hear from institutions that they have this thought about what the rule says, but they haven't read the rules specifically. Not that we expect everyone to read the rules, but somebody at the institution needs to have that primary source review. We write a lot about these things from that you will find in WCET Frontiers and other publications. So those are great secondary sources, and we try to break it down for you. But there does need to be somebody who is reviewing it specifically to know the exact language and not compliance by rumor. And the other thing that I would share is that just very recently, the undersecretary was speaking to NASFA at the financial aid conference that they were holding just 2 weeks ago, indicating that he is very aware of the variety of things that are coming at institutions at a steady pace and a lot of ups and downs and announcements. And he indicated that what the Department of Education would be looking for was working to comply, wanting to see a structure, wanting to see that you are making, every phrase short of good faith effort is what he was saying. So he's wanting to see, he believes that they would be reviewing the institution in that light in their efforts to be in compliance. Also, as a secondary source, WCET and SAN created the policy tracker, and we try to keep that very much up to date with some direction of where we are with the different policies, whether they be statutes, regulations, court actions, guidance, and executive orders. So we hope that you'll make use of that.
And Kim just put that link in the chat. You beat me to it, Cheryl. I was going to make sure that folks knew about the policy tracker. We've got 3 minutes left. In the last minute, one thing that you want institutions to know, Catherine?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I would say one thing to know is that, WCET and SAN will always do our best to keep you informed. And I would also just say, know that you have a community out there to answer questions, especially in the area of compliance. I mean, there is understanding what the rule says and then understanding how to implement it. So knowing that you can stay connected and ask some of those implementation questions, I think is really key to, doing what's best for your institution and finding the right strategy to move forward.
Cheryl, one thing that you want institutions to take away today and know?
Yes, thank you. So in looking at some of the questions, and I respond to some of them within the question structure, please understand the difference between program approval and institutional approval. People were asking about SARA and reciprocity in relation to professional licensure and to workforce Pell. And what I want to really stress is that program approval is different than institutional approval to be able to generally offer activities, distance education related activities in another state. You may also need the program approval, whether it be nursing, et cetera, or a workforce Pell program for those bilateral agreements I was talking about. Your institution has institutional approval, but you might also need program approval through this bilateral agreement to be able to offer the workforce Pell program in another state.
Okay, great. So I want to thank Cheryl and Catherine for their expertise and their time today. I want to thank all of you for being so engaged with us. It is greatly appreciative. I think that you get a sense that we have a very strong community here at WCET, a very strong community within SAN, and it's important that we stay connected and we work together and learn from each other. We will be sending out the webcast recording and any additional resources and slides next week, but it will also be available at wce.edu, wcet.wce.edu events webcasts, and that you can always visit wcet.wce.edu to explore policy and practice work events, membership and sponsorship, as well as WCET-SAN.wce.edu to look at the SAN resources. If this was your first time engaging with WCET and SAN, we hope that you'll stay connected. We want you to be aware that we've got another webcast coming up on August 20th, Accessibility in Action, Lessons from the One Ed Tech and WCET Workshop Series. That'll be August 20th, noon Mountain Time. And that also you're aware that we have our annual conference coming up, WCET 2026. Please join us in Minneapolis. That'll be October 14th through 16th. There is a policy track that is associated with that conference, as well as a number of pre-conference events. And you can register for that conference. We have early bird registration through tomorrow, I believe. So make sure that you register early to get that less expensive rate. And then lastly, I want to thank our annual sponsors who make much of our programming and activities here at WCET happen, as well as our supporting members who have decided that it is important to invest in WCET on top of their annual membership dues. We are greatly appreciative of them. And again, thank you for your attendance today and spending a part of your day with us. Take care.